Hello, students. Just wanted to take a few minutes to make a short video about the first topic that we're going to discuss this unit, which is on the Industrial Revolution. So notice the dates there, 1860s to 1900s. It's important for you to note that this is really the era in American history that starts after the Civil War is over, but before World War I is fought in the early 1900s. This era is also called the Gilded Age, and we'll use that term a lot in class. Gilded means that something is covered in gold on the outside, but on the inside, it's not necessarily golden. So, and you'll see society kind of reflects that. There's some really good things, some bright and shiny golden looking things on the outside that makes America look wonderful during this time period. And then there's also some things on the inside that maybe don't look so great. And so we'll talk about all of those things during this chapter on the Industrial Revolution. So the first topic is on industry and the railroads. You may want to jot down the main idea and the key vocab and people, or you can just look on your assignment sheet where that information is also listed. But I'm going to go ahead and read the main idea. During the late 1800s, new technology led to rapid industrial growth and the expansion of railroads. So we're going to look at that here over the next couple of minutes, how new technology led to rapid industrial growth and the expansion of the railroads. If at any point you need to pause the video, if you are taking notes, feel free to pause it, write down what you need to write down, and carry on. So just a couple of slides here about industry and the railroads, and I'm going to move my face so you can see this nice chart. But that's also blocking some words, but that's okay. In the mid-1800s, a guy named Henry Bessemer perfected a process for creating steel in a much cheaper manner. Prior to the use of steel, most buildings, bridges, railroads, etc., were built out of iron. And so because steel was easier to create and it was cheaper to create, and it was stronger and more durable than iron, it really took off. And so as you can see from this graph down here, American steel production, and I'll stop moving my mouse so you can see, it's really hard to see specifically the dates listed down below, but you can kind of see them on the chart. In 1880, the United States produced 33% of the world's steel. That number steadily climbs throughout the next couple of decades. And part of the reason is because we used steel to build a lot of railroads. And we'll see that on the next slide. But in addition to railroads, steel was used to build buildings, as well as larger bridges around the United States. And the buildings come into play because we're going to see in the next couple of decades way more skyscrapers being built. It's really tough to build a skyscraper out of brick. In fact, it's not a good idea, or wood. But as these buildings are being constructed with a foundation of steel, you can build these massively tall skyscrapers that are actually structurally sound. Oil companies also started drilling into different locations around the United States. Pennsylvania and Texas both became pretty common drilling locations. And again, you can see by the graph at the bottom right the massive growth in U.S. oil production. And obviously, this is before most people even drove automobiles. So we're talking oil is in its infant stages of being used. This is nothing compared to what oil production is going to look like as we get closer to the present. So railroads may have been the most significant advancement in the 19th century, the 1800s. You can see the map over there on the right-hand side of the screen. The number of railroads built in 1870 compared to the number of railroads built even 20 years later. It's just the impact of railroads was so significant, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But over there on the left, railroads expanding. The Transcontinental Railroad, which is this railroad built right here to Omaha. It was completed in 1869, officially linking the West and the East Coasts in the United States. One thing that you want to pay particular attention to is the second bullet point over here, where it says the government funded much of the expansion by giving land to railroad companies. Railroad companies made a fortune because if you can envision a railroad track and then envision at least several miles on each side, north and south or east and west of the railroad track, that land was given to railroad companies in addition to the actual ability to build the track. And so after the tracks were built, the railroad companies would oftentimes sell this land because it was the most valuable land because it was right by the railroad. And so railroad companies not only made a fortune building railroads, but they made a fortune selling land that had been given to them by the government on which to build the railroads. So good for railroad companies. A lot of billionaires came out of this era. Well, millionaires, but they would have been billionaires by today's standards. Some effects of the expansion. One, they promoted trade and provided jobs. Building railroads takes a lot of workers. And so there were a lot of people who were employed by the railroad for many years. It also promoted trade. It's easier and cheaper to ship stuff on a railroad than to load up the old horse and buggy and drive whatever it is that you're trying to sell to a market. Railroads are much cheaper and faster. Sped up Western land settlement. It's more appealing if you are a really, really poor Italian immigrant living in New York City and you are one of 8 kids and you have nothing. It is appealing to hop on a train and go out west where there's an abundance of land. It's less appealing to walk that far. So a lot of people went west because it was easier to get there because of the railroad. It also, and this gets cut off at the bottom of the slide, it led to the adoption of standard time. One random interesting part of U.S. history is the fact that prior to railroads being built all over the U.S., there wasn't necessarily a standard time being used, but it became really important if there was one track going between, Los Angeles and San Francisco. It wasn't a two-way track, and so they had to know what time it was in San Francisco when the train left so that they knew what time it would arrive in Los Angeles, and that there were no trains that would meet one another on the tracks on the way to and from locations. So anyway, that's all for topic 1, industry and the railroads. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in just a minute with topic number 2.